Då välkomna till vår allmän föreläsning här på Slaviska institutionen. Idag har vi en föreläsning om polsk litteratur i engelsk översättning och nu ska jag byta till engelska. Our guest today is from University College in London, Dr. Ursula Phillips. She's honorary research associate at the University College London at Schools of Slavonic and East European Studies. She's a writer on Polish literature and on Polish contemporary literature and also older Polish literature. She's writer on Polish women writers. She has translated many Polish women writers into English. Zofia Naukowska, Maria Wittenberska, and Narcyza Żmichowska. For those who don't know anything about Polish literature, these are very older writers. They are from 19th century. I mean Wittenberska and Żmichowska. She also translated contemporary literature, Wiesław Myśliwski, Agnieszka Taborska, and she keeps translating and revising our academic work here in Scandinavia, but also by Polish literary scholars. I will pass on some of the anthologies she has edited with other scholars here in Scandinavia, and also an anthology of Polish women writers that she wrote with Polish scholars. This is, we can say, some kind of how to say?
Well, it's an initial research, initial compendium or guide to women writers.
That were absent from literary canon in Poland, or they are not so...
Well, some of them are now, but the majority of them are still hardly ever discussed.
Yes, so just pass them on so you can look at these things, these books, and Ursula will send later her books which are translated into English for Polish writers. And today Ursula will speak, because she already had a talk here at Slavic department on Monday, but today she will talk about balancing the Polish literary canon in English from spiritual autobiography to spiritualist medium. So,
thank you very much,
Renata,
and thank you very much for coming. It's a great honour to be here in Stockholm. My title refers specifically to two works I'm currently translating. Spiritual Autobiography of a Carmelite nun who lived in the 17th century, and to the Spiritualist medium, who is the subject of a very modern work, some short prose that was written by a contemporary writer, Agnieszka Taborska, which was published in 2013. So you have a 400-year almost gap between these two writers, and these are projects that I'm currently working on, and I will come back to those at the end. Now, my project to translate Polish women of the past, not just contemporary ones, but of the past, was inspired by my own feeling and awareness that very few women were actually ever discussed in literary studies in Poland, or indeed in British or American university courses outside Poland. And, you know, if there is a question why, then the answer to that question is very simple, that I myself am a woman, and I have always felt the lack of women in literary studies. I studied Russian in the 70s. In the course that I did at Durham University, we did mention Akhmatova and Svetaeva, but apart from them there was nobody else. And the German courses that I did had absolutely no women at all. And when I studied Polish literature in the 80s, we studied only one woman, and here she is, Eliza Orzeszkowa. And most people who have studied something of Polish literature will be aware of her existence. Now, what is interesting though is how little she has been translated into English. Now, this is not to say she's not been translated into some other languages. During her lifetime, she was translated into German. And in the 1890s, she worked very closely with Russian literary journals. And she actually supervised the translation of some of her novels into Russian at the same time as they appeared in Polish. So to say there are no translations of Orzeszkowa would be wrong. But there are very, very few to English. Now, if you look at the second title here, Nad Niemnem, 1888, this is her most well-known novel in Poland and outside Poland. It's a very long novel. It covers a lot of key issues to do with contemporary Polish society and politics and social life. It covers, a lot about the economic collapse of the gentry class, but it's never been translated into English. And neither has an early novel, which is very feminist, Marta. This basically is a novel about showing how women's education was so impoverished that it was useless. So that if a woman was not married, or in the case of this novel, she was widowed, she really had no means of earning a living. So this has also not been translated into English. The only one of her main novels, and she wrote many, that has been translated into English, is Mir Ezofowicz, which is about a Jewish gentleman. And I suggest to you that that is why this has been translated, because the subject of Jewish history in American universities, particularly also in British, is very popular at the moment. Yeah, there's been a great surge to re-establish this as part of study. So I suggest to you that is why that's been translated, but none of her other major novels have been translated. Now, sorry about the picture here. This was I couldn't get a better image of this. Now, this collection was published 30 years ago. Some of you may be familiar with it. Russian and Polish women's fiction. There's actually quite a lot more Polish fiction in it than Russian. And these are the Polish stories, the Polish writers that Kościuszko includes. Yeah, and you can see. All of these are major figures. These are not obscure writers that Kościuszko has dug up from somewhere. Yeah, for feminist purposes. They are major writers. But it's just on the level of short stories, no major novels, and none of the major novels of any of these writers until recently have been translated at all. 30 years ago that came out. There is this exception, Zofia Naukowska Medallions, which is some short fiction that Naukowska wrote towards the end of her life about the Holocaust. She was part of Polish official government commission into researching Nazi crimes in Germany, and these stories she wrote on the basis of testimony she heard. Literary critics do not really rate this particularly highly in compare, as from a literary point of view, when compared with her other novels, which do not exist in English, or didn't until recently. But again, because of the subject matter, I think this has been translated. Gabriela Zapolska, also a very important writer, the reason why I include her here is because I wanted to sort of acknowledge Teresa Murias, who is a drama specialist. She teaches at the University of Reading in the drama department. She's actually Polish. She's from Warsaw, but she's lived in Britain for many years. And she has translated 4 of Zapolska's plays. So, apart from a few isolated texts which particular translators have picked out, or particular person like Murias has concentrated on one author like that because she wanted to produce her plays, there has been very little translation into English of Polish women writers. Even today, Tokarczuk, some of her books have been translated. There have been the odd translations of Masłowska or Hutnik, but again, it's very random. So my programme has been my own personal project, which is my own initiative. It wasn't suggested to me by any publisher, was to systematically translate women writers of the past who I value and who've been valued by critics, yeah, those that have written about them. Now, as we know, in the 80s, 90s, there was this enormous movement of archaeology, as I call it, to uncover women writers that had been forgotten about. And it was tended to be done according to national languages, yeah? And I bring these to your attention because these are very, very good volumes, if you're not aware of them. The Garden book was published in '94, and Helena Forster Scott was published in '98. And they managed, Athlone Press, very good publisher. They also did an Italian collection, history, a Spanish one, and French one. When I got round to suggesting Polish women's writing, the project had run out of funds, so it didn't get anywhere. This was a book that I was involved with a project led by Celia Wooksworth, who was a teacher at University College School of Slight East European Studies of the Yugoslav languages. Yeah, she's an expert on Croatian and Serbian literature. And we tried to make our own contribution to this archaeology. Yeah? And this book covers Polish, Czech, Slovak, Hungarian, and the Yugoslav languages. And because it's just one volume about that thick, obviously it can't cover everything. But what we didn't do, we wanted to do, but we didn't get our act together, we didn't have the money, we didn't have the publisher, was to do an accompanying volume of translations. Because I think this project actually, fell flat, because there were no translations to accompany it. So if we had interested the research community beyond our specific languages, people interested in the history of Romanticism or the history of women's studies generally, they could not read the texts and then contribute themselves to further research, yeah? Which is where this project, I think, scored better, which is Catriona Kelly's book, which you're probably aware of, yeah? Because Catriona, at the same time, and maybe this was published with Oxford, they probably had more money than Butler at the time. I don't know. But Catriona saw the sense, yeah, of publishing at the same time an anthology, and some of these are her translations, some of them are older translations, some are ones that she commissioned specifically for the book, yeah? And then, these were published in '94, immediately after that, there was this very good volume of women's shorter fiction by Jo Andrew. I mean, this is mostly a 19th century work. So there was all that sort of backup there, which, we didn't have. So I decided I was going to do it on my own. Before I go on and talk about the specific books that I've translated, I just wanted to make you aware of this phenomenon, feminist translation. And if anybody's interested in this, I've got a bibliography with me that I can introduce you. There isn't time now to go into it in detail. Let me say that this group of people on the left there called themselves feminist translators, but they were working in a very specific cultural environment, namely the translation of Canadian French or Quebecois into English. And they were mostly feminist books in the French original, and they were very concerned that that the feminist element should not be lost. And I include Howard Scott here just to prove the fact that to be a feminist or a feminist translator, you don't have to be a woman. Then on the right, these are the people that have written about this phenomenon, and I would say it's died a death. Not because of the lack of interest or lack of reason for translating women, but because the principles were not really basically any different from modern principles of translation generally, yeah? Of being empathetic to the text, not violating the text in any way, of the cultural transfer, all these issues about domesticating the text. They sort of apply to women writers as well. So I'm not advocating this so-called feminist translation. What I want to do is make a difference though between feminist translation, it called itself feminist translation, and translating as a feminist, which is what I do. So, I mean, these kind of questions are the sort of questions that then come into play. Is it an ideological agenda? Sure it is. Everything we do has some ideological aspect. It does, it's unashamed of the fact that it has an ideological agenda. It is intended to bring the female into the whole study of literature on the same level and par and valuation as men's writing. Then, we have all these sort of terms floating around in English anyway. Women's writing. I prefer the term female authorship. Or is it just writing? These are kind of issues that are thrown up, and I could spend all day talking about them. But what I want to do really is, given that the focus today is my translation project, that I'm going to sort of move to that slowly, and then, I'm very happy to come back and discuss, in the discussion period, any of these aspects. But of course, how does it work? Well, obviously, if you're looking at it from a female perspective, or from a specifically feminist perspective, which is the kind of perspective that is observing discrimination and wishing to do something about that, then it affects above all the choice of text. Identifying the texts and selecting which ones you're going to translate. Now this involved an enormous amount of research, which went on for several years, as you can imagine. I mean, most of these writers are mentioned in encyclopedias. They are in library catalogues. So myself and the other two people that contributed to that book that I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. We did a lot of research in order to establish who was important, and with the writers that I'm going to talk about first in a minute, Wtemberska and Żmichowska, I also did a lot of research to find out who had written about them when. And it's really quite interesting that in the interwar period, that is, when Poland was an independent country, between 1918 and 1939, major critics, and I'm talking about Juliusz Kleiner, Wacław Borowy, Konstanty Wojciechowski, they wrote about Malwina, they wrote about Wittenbergska in this period. And Żmichowska was also promoted, not only republished and everything, but promoted by Tadeusz Bojalenski, and also by another critic called Tadeusz Szynko. So it's quite interesting that in that period, when the Polish state wasn't so threatened, that there was a slightly, I would say, a more sympathetic attitude towards women and women's writing, and that's something else that we can, and that's how something that's re-emerged as well, of course, since 1990, and we can talk about that. So you have to be sensitive to the content. Is it about women's lives? Is it about women's suffering? Is it about women's emotional lives? Is it about discrimination? For example, one area that women write about a lot is education. And the fact that they didn't have such good education, either in an academic sense or in a professional sense, men, so looking out for these type of themes, and then the language, because the language itself, is actually quite important. The style of the language and what kind of emotional register comes. And I talked about this the other day. Comes over, Now paratexts. This is quite a strong, I think, an important element in what I do. So, whereas those feminist translators, people that called themselves such, introduced elements into the text itself to try and make it feminist, I've not done that. I've not fiddled around with the text. My attitude has been to be sensitive to and convey in English what is already in the text. Where the paratexts are the things that I've added, like footnotes, explanations. If some woman is mentioned, for example, in passing, I've given a footnote to explain who she was. She might have been a well-known artist at the time, but nobody's forgotten who she is now, Things like that. And also a long introduction. All these books on the older women, not contemporary women, I've provided with a long introduction where I've given something on the biography, I've put the woman in the context of Polish literature at the time, and I've discussed what the book is about, and what are the literary influences, and in what way I think it's important as a woman's text. And you can take it or leave it. You can read the text, you don't have to pay any attention to my notes or my introduction if you don't want to. But if you are interested in reading these women as writers as women, then I think it can probably enhance your experience of the book. And of course all this has implications for the canon in translation, and also it has a knock-on effect on the canon in Polish, and I've already seen that happen in a few cases. Because I'm not just doing this in order to balance, or shift general perceptions in the English-speaking world of Polish culture generally amongst the general readership, but also these are supposed to be useful in Polish studies, in universities. And obviously, with the general trend in American universities, and also in Britain I have to say, away from teaching the texts in the original language, or only in the original language, translations are becoming very important. They're becoming important as aids to study the Polish, or they're actually replacing the Polish. And this is also because in many universities, in order to survive at all, Polish literary studies have had to enter the comparative game. And this is happening, for example, at the University of Glasgow, where Polish literature is taught in a comparative context, and some of my texts are used in this, in the sort of 19th century literature, where the students are reading in translation, not just these Polish ones, but German, French, Italian. So it's within this context. So, given that situation, and the fact that increasing number of courses are only being taught in translation, if a text does not exist in translation, it's totally invisible, doesn't exist at all. So the effect on the canon is, quite fundamental. So this is, part of my intentions. But we can come back to discussing any of those issues. This is the book that Renata was showing. This came out in 2000. At the top here, you can see the little figure there. That is Maria Temperska. And I'll show you, here she is, those are her dates. She was Czartoryska by birth. She was the daughter of Izabela Czartoryska and Adam Kazimierz Czartoryski, so she was the sister, the older sister of Adam Jerzy Czartoryski, foreign minister of Alexander I. So she was an aristocrat, highly educated lady. She knew French as well as she knew English. More closely at them now. Yes, I've translated the title as Malvina or the Heart's Intuition. This is the first edition, 1816. This is I want you to read these books, so I'm not going to spoil you and tell you exactly what happens. But this is a book which is an epistolatory novel. So it's very much influenced by Richardson, by Clarissa, also by Lawrence Stern. She actually talks about Stern in the text. As I said, she was fluent in French, so you can see French influence as well. She was also influenced by the Gothic novel. She read Anne Radcliffe, and either in English or in French translations. She was influenced by Ossian, James Macpherson, the so-called bard of the 3rd century. But a lot of the imagery is taken from Ossian. So you can see all these European influences. So it's not just a text that's about women's feelings. It's very much about women's feelings, women's intuitions. But it is also I would say, European text, which reflects reading of contemporary literature, and its value is for that, not just for the fact that it's Polish. It does have a Polish context. The context, of course, is the defeat of Napoleon and the tragedy that brought to Poland, or whichever way you want to look at it. So that military history and that campaign is in the background of the book and the political implications, but it's not really about that. There she is. This is a portrait of her that was done by Angelika Kaufmann. She never met the Temperska. This was a sort of rather idealised portrait based on a description of her by her mother, Isabella Czartoryska. And this is probably more like what she looked like. And if we pass round the first edition of the translation, there's yet another portrait, which was the one that I rather liked on the front here. What's that? Now this is, it was, as I said, it was published in 1816. It was certainly popular at the time. And this is another thing that we can think about, you know, in relation to women's texts, that they were known at the time. This was not an obscure text that I dug up. Yeah? It was well reviewed. It saw several editions in the 1820s. It was translated into French in 1822 and into Russian in 1835. Now, it didn't see any editions, in fact, later in the 19th century. It was revived in the interwar period by this critic, Konstanty Wojciechowski. This is the Biblioteka Narodowa series, which is what I was talking about the other day, which are generally considered to be the standard editions, yeah? A bit like, I suppose, Oxford Classics, yeah? Where you've got notes, introduction, revision of the text by a well-known critic of the day. Now, I didn't actually use this edition. I should have done, maybe, because that's the one that translators usually use, because it was actually updated by another publisher. Oh, she was also an artist. I just throw that in. This was published in 1971 by Czytelnik, edited by Witold Bilip. So I used this edition because it had been quite considerably updated. And this was the first edition. Of interest to you may be the fact that this was typeset by Ingunn Lunde. I know some of you know her well, a colleague from Bergen, who I've known for many years. And I just want to say something very briefly about the publication history, because that's also very telling. Both this novel, which is sort of pre-Romanticism, and the Żmiechowska, which I think we can published 1846, which we can say is a romantic text, would have fitted beautifully into the Angel Books series. And I don't know if any of you Russianists know Angel Books, but they are run by a man called Anthony Wood. He's also a translator himself. He's done a lot of Pushkin, and he publishes romantic works. And he's done, Pushkin. He's done Fontana. He's done Goethe, a new edition of The Sufferings of Jan Goethe. And I felt that it would have fitted beautifully into his publishing program, but he wasn't prepared to take a risk on this. They were unknown writers. And I eventually ended up publishing this with the Polish Cultural Foundation in London, and so this sort of rather went against my general wish to get the translations out of the Polish environment and get them published by a proper standard English publisher. But the Cultural Foundation were well prepared to do it, and they said, well, if you can provide it, camera ready, we'll do it. Well done. So Ingunn and I prepared it, and they printed it. And when it goes round, and I think some of you have got it already, you'll see on the back of the title page is a very ambitious little note which says #1 in a series of Polish women, and I'm afraid for them it remained #1 because the publishing house collapsed, or they closed it down. They still publish the Dziennik Polski, the newspaper, but they don't publish books anymore. So, this happened in 2001. Now, this is the second edition. Now, it was almost by a stroke of luck that David Goldfarb, who at the time he came across this, was teaching at Columbia, he came across it and loved it, and he bought about 25 copies and taught it to his students. When he then became the Officer for Literature at the Polish Cultural Institute in New York, he decided he was going to help me find a proper publisher. And with his assistance, I was put in touch with the Northern Illinois University Press. They arranged to meet me at the London Book Fair. We had a conversation, and they were pleased and happy to do it. Now, also very lucky, it was well reviewed. The first edition had been well reviewed. reviewed in a lot of places. So I had quite a lot of feedback. So I was able to, correct a few small errors that people picked up, and also to expand the introduction. And one of the reviewers was Helena Phillips, the feminist scholar in the States, and she felt that the introduction was much too mild. It needed some more, history of women and some more feminist input. So I built up the introduction. So the second edition has an expanded introduction, but basically it's the same, and it's still England setting. Yeah? Okay, so that's Maria Wittenbergska. This is the next one that I did. Narcyza Żmichowska. She's generally regarded as being the first outspokenly emancipationist, yeah, in Polish literature and generally in society, I suppose. And she was part of a very radical group of women and men that was sort of spread across, because Poland, of course, didn't exist on the map then. We went to various cultural centres, Poznan and Warsaw particularly, that really believed, the people that were really radical ideas about society generally. And of course all that ended with the uprisings and the suppressions that happened in the late 40s. But that's basically the context in which she began, in which she wrote this novel, The Pagan. Poganka, not Pagan. That's a photograph of her that was taken later in her life. She was well known as an educator as well. She wrote on education. Now, the novel was published in a journal, which was published by this radical group in the 40s. That's where it first appeared. Then it appeared in some collected works in 1861. It didn't appear again. It was well known at the time, again, but again it just fell out of discussion, forgotten about. It was revived in the late 20s by this critic, Tadeusz Żeleński, or a very well-known critic. And he was particularly interested in Żmichowska because Żmichowska, his mother, had been a pupil and a very close friend and correspondent of Żmichowska. So she was his godmother, So there was, a very close sort of connection there by him. Published their letters and kinds of things. So he revived not only this novel but several other novels by her. And this is the edition that I have used, yeah? Because it's been published in various sort of cheap colourful editions since. But this is the to date was the best one available. It was, as I said, it was published in 1929 and it was reissued in 1950. So it was the 1950 one that I used. However, a year after my translation, which will now do the rounds, Grażyna Borkowska published a new edition of it. I know Borkowska quite well. I've translated her academic work. She was my former supervisor. So we were in close contact. And so my translation actually includes the changes that are here. So, we were in close contact, she read the translation, she gave me a critique of it. So I feel confident that, my translation takes into consideration all the latest research onto this particular novel. And here it is. Again, I could spend half an hour explaining why I translated this as the heathen and not as the pagan, but we can return to that, okay, if anybody's interested in that. And this is the latest one that I've published, Zofia Naukowska Szuka, that's how it's pronounced. I've heard some pretty weird pronunciations of this from Polish friends. Halcas was the best, but it's actually a French word and it refers to a type of bird that lives in the high Alps. And this is a sort of Thomas Mann type portrayal of society in a Swiss sanatorium in the 20s, where she was for a time. She wasn't ill, but her then husband was ill, and that's why they were there. Yeah, and it's I think an extremely moving portrayal of people's sorrow, and particularly women's sorrow. And one issue that comes out a lot is ageing. and female ageing, and I talked about this, a lot the other day when we looked at that passage from Granica, but it's already present in other books. And it's interesting, that she keeps a diary. She kept a diary most of her life, and she kept a diary of this period in Switzerland, and then she reworked bits of it into the novel, and bits in the diary where she talks about herself. Oh, I'm getting old, oh, I'm losing my beauty, oh, I'm ugly, I feel dreadful, I want to commit suicide. Well, she doesn't actually do that. She doesn't actually say I want to commit suicide, but it's very, very depressed. But in the novel, the character she puts into one of the characters the exact words from the diary, exact words. And this character does actually commit suicide. So there's a sort of melancholy in this book. And it's also quite by serendipity that it's come out now. It wasn't intentional. But one of the underlying themes in this is the Armenian genocide. Because when she was there in Switzerland, in Lausanne, in the High Alps, French-speaking part of Switzerland, she met Armenian women who had been put there in the sanatorium by the Swiss Red Cross because they hadn't got anywhere else to put them. They'd rescued them from Armenia itself or from Greece, where they'd fled. And so the relationship between the narrator and these Armenian women and their experience, and what they saw and witnessed is very key, I think, to understanding this book, because it's a big plea against nationalism, all forms of nationalism, violence, political violence, and it's, it has this sort of theme, this scene at the end where you've got the birds sort of whirling over the valley when the narrator leaves, and you think, well, what is this? Is this a warning? It's quite a threatening image. Is this a warning about what's hanging over Europe? So you almost intuited, from her observations, the sort of development of, violent power. Yeah. Okay, so there she is in Lausanne in 1925, her walking gear. And this is how she looked in 1936, which is when she wrote this book, which was the one that we were talking about the other day. Granica, I'm translating it as Boundary. It's her best known novel. I wouldn't myself say it's necessarily her best novel. It's her best known novel. It's taught in schools. It's been taught in schools throughout the communist period, and it still is on the school reading list. So it's pretty well known. And a lot of Polish people I talked to about it have a very negative view of it because they did it in school and it was taught in a particular way and there is a board stiff with it. But as I was trying to explain the other day, it's very much, it can be interpreted as a woman's text, not only, but as a woman's text. It's about power. It's about power of men over women's lives. The main theme is about a rejected lover who has an abortion and the kind of psychological effects this has on her life, which in turn drives the action, the plot of the novel. So it's a very important novel. I have already translated this. It's not come out yet. It's with the publisher. I've written a massive introduction to this, which was reviewed by Hannah Kirchner, who is the leading scholar on Nałkowska. So I hope it does her justice. Now I'm also translating another work now by her, Niecierpliwy. It literally means the impatient people, or the impatient ones. And like with the translation of Boundary, Granica, it's very challenging just to find one word to translate that. So I'm going with impatience at the moment. I had the impatience, but then I thought that sounded a bit too like The Incredibles, so I've got rid of the, and it says, we'll go. Maybe I'll just use impatience, I don't know, it's open to discussion. And I should also mention another work by Nałkowska that came out from the same publisher by two colleagues, Megan Thomas and Emma Nałkowska-Pasek, The Romance of Teresa Hennet, which was a book that Nałkowska originally published in 1924. So we're gradually, making her visible. And I have a plan, which is supported by the Polish Cultural Institute in London, to have a little symposium, maybe for a day, on Naukowska's life in English. So Megan and Eva will be there, and I intend to invite the translator of Medaglione and maybe even Helena Kostyulas to talk about how we can make this really great novelist better known to English literary studies community. Now this is how am I doing for time?
Yes, it's okay.
Yeah. Now I'm moving into spiritualist mediums and spiritual autobiography. Now this is Agnieszka Taborska. Those of you who came to my seminar the other day, we looked at a text by her that I translated for an art exhibition about the sea. She started life as an art historian. She's an expert on surrealism. She has translated into Polish a lot of the key texts of surrealism, including Breton and other manifestos, Breton, André Breton, and many other surrealists. She writes short prose, obviously very much influenced by surrealism. It has very vivid imagery. It's very brief. It requires a very kind of focused translation style, which in fact is also required by Naukowska, but she is even more of an expert on creating the brief, punchy sentence, I would say. Yeah. She's also interested in Freudian psychoanalysis, dream theory, so all these kind of, and feminism. But she's not an active feminist in the sense that she's not bringing out feminist issues, but she does, her whole work speaks to a feminist consciousness, I would say. And she does children's books as well, usually works with well-known illustrators. Now, this is the first book that I did for her, Niedokończone życie Phoebe Hicks, The Unfinished Life of Phoebe Hicks. Now, this came out in 2013 in Gdańsk. We publish Słowo Obraz Terytoria. And it was accompanied, it's short, as I say, it's short prose, it's only about 160 pages. And it's accompanied by these rather weird collages done by one of her students. So she takes elements of the picture of Phoebe Hicks, which I'll show you in a minute, and adds other elements which sort of give it this sort of dreamy quality, spiritualist quality. Yeah. Now, Phoebe Hicks is an invented character, but already the reviews have assumed that she was a real person. But she was a real person, but not necessarily a spiritualist, because Agnieszka, one of the things that she loves doing in Providence, Rhode Island, which is where she spends half the year teaching at an art college, and the rest of the year she spends in Warsaw writing. She goes around old junk shops and she found this wonderful photograph, and it was what's called a Tolbert type, which predates the daguerreotype, of a beautiful woman. And she bought this, and all it had on the back, it said Phoebe Hicks, 1850. And she then created this imaginative story of a female medium. And of course, at that time in America, spiritualism was really big, and there were a lot of female mediums. And you only have to read The Bostonians by Henry James to realise how important this was. In Proust, those of you who know Proust's Emancipanki, his novel, there is a female spiritualist in that as well. So it was a very common thing. And one thing that she asks in this book, through these little stories, is the connection, between female mediums and emancipation. And she asks, well, why did women do this? Because and what was the reality of it? Because she doesn't believe in it any more than I do, that you can communicate with some spirit world. But they were frauds. But why were they frauds? Did they use it to express something which in normal everyday life they couldn't express? Now, that is the general overall thing. But as I said, it contains little stories. It's built up of these little stories that describe the various seances. And this is another one of the collages, and that is actually the photograph of Phoebe behind that. And if you'll allow me to, and I know that there are some Russianists here, could I read just a little bit of it? I'm not going to read one of the more female-orientated ones, but I will read this just to give you a taste of this author, because she's not been translated into Swedish. I suggest that, you know, one of you might think about possibly translating her into Swedish, and she's a very easy person to work with. She's very precise, but you know, we work very, very closely together, and it's a very, very rewarding experience. So I'm going to read you this section. I hope you can all understand me. I'm not talking too fast, am I? No. The nose. The most curious event in the spiritualist practice of Phoebe Hicks was the manifestation of the nose. It materialised towards the close of the 66th seance, when the guests, wearied by a lack of response from the beyond, were about to disband and go home. Moments before the clock struck 10:30, semi-transparent plasma began to emerge from Phoebe's mouth, arousing consternation among first-time participants. The birth of the plasma lasted a good half hour, since wreaths of cotton wool-like material was still emanating from the medium's mouth when 11 chimed. When it looked as though the table and ring of hands were about to disappear beneath it, the plasma broke away from Phoebe and slid off the tabletop with an unpleasant squelch. Once on the floor, it seemed to go on growing, though this was an illusion, since it was merely seeking a place to fully materialise. The parlour was spacious enough for the peregrinations of the obviously disturbed plasma to last until 11:30. Absorbed by the spectacle, the spiritualist paid no attention to the passing of time. Only Phoebe's cat arched its back, snorted, and retreated under a chair. Having chosen at last the oval carpet by the fireplace, the plasma stopped, coughed, and began to assume the contours of a nose. A huge upturned honker with a brown wart at its tip. Suspense rose among the witnesses, and Phoebe's astonishment intensified as she struggled to observe the metamorphosis, exhausted by sitting for so long with her mouth open. The transformation was accompanied by sucking sounds, like when you stick your finger in a jar of jam. When the nose was almost fully formed, the remaining traces of plasma tried to hide under the carpet, but it called them to heel by clearing its throat. Midnight struck. The nose rebuked the stupefied guests with a cutting stare. By now it had reached the height of the heftiest participant in the 66th seance. Interpreters of Phoebe's mediumistic history later claimed the visitation of the nose proved her ability to govern not only the world of apparitions, but also the world of literature. For indeed, barely had the nose assumed its full proportions when a briefcase appeared under the arm sprung from its left lobe, as did a pair of horn-rimmed eyeglasses over the wart, as well as decorations covering the pale surface of its skin. Fortunately, the seance participants did not arouse its interest, and the unpleasant visit quickly drew to a close. It managed to jot down a few denunciations in the notebook it had taken from the briefcase, swept another devastating glance over the company, pushed aside the maid with a gesture suffering no resistance, strode vigorously through to the hall, opened the front door and disappeared into the night. No one had enough presence of mind to spring to their feet, rush to the window and watch it move off past the quaint colonial houses of Benefit Street. So there are a lot of other Russian allusions in this as well. Okay, this is her latest book, which I'm translating now. Nie tak jak w raju, not as in paradise. And again, it's a series of short, sort of surrealistic, imaginative little pieces about present-day life. Yeah, not just in Poland, but in Europe generally, things that we attach importance to that are not important. And she sort of, that each piece ends with a little punchline, which really brings it down to earth. And it's absolutely, it's a joy to read. It's very, very clever. And this book has been illustrated by Klimovsky, Andrzej Klimovsky, with these black and white drawings, not as in Paradise. And if I have time, I was going to read another little bit from this. Yeah, of course. Yeah. How long have I got? 5-10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you think it's okay?
Yeah. Time loop. This just gives you a taste of the kind of things that they are. This one is that one. Yeah. Sometimes they're just a sentence or two. Other times they're 3 or 4 pages, and they're dealing with some sort of issue. Time loop. It was Pentla. Polish was Pentla. But you'll see why I use time loop and not just loop in a minute. Now, just before I start, she has a series of characters which are just referred to by an initial, yeah? And the character in this one is E. After 20 years of living in the States, E arrived with her adult children to show them their old house in the Warsaw district of Sardinia. This is where Agnieszka lives. It's on the way out of Warsaw down towards Wilanów, and it's very sort of leafy, sort of nice place. The house had changed little, except that in these ecological times, a glass recycling bin had sprung up beside it. Yet it was barely visible beneath the mountain of smashed bottles. E was too deeply moved to let the sight upset her, though she did not want at any cost her children to notice it. She wished them to have the best possible impressions of the country. Trying to direct their gaze the other way, she began to tell them a rumour, remembered from those dim and distant times. And so, in the neighbouring house, a pretty woman had lived with 2 husbands, which back then, even in artistic circles, had caused a certain sensation. The children liked the story. There was still hope they wouldn't notice the ecological shambles. And then, as they stood with their backs to the bottles, in the window of the flat where a quarter of a century ago the pretty woman had lived with her husbands, the curtains were drawn aside. Against the backdrop of the brightly lit interior, a girl appeared. A moment later, a young man popped up beside her on the right and kissed her on the cheek. She had no time to respond with a smile before a second young man approached from the left and also kissed her. She took half a step back, snuggling up at the same time to both. The man on the left and the man on the right, with their arms around her. The whole troika froze in a state of bliss, staring at the autumn early that year beyond the winter. E and her children were afraid to move in case they shattered the spell. Tears trickled down E's cheeks. For the first time in her life, she had observed how time goes round in a loop. In order for the miracle to happen, very little was required. It was enough to concentrate one's thoughts on something as banal as a heap of broken glass. So that's the kind of thing. It's sort of got a poetic dimension. Sometimes it's quite romantic, but it always brings you plonk down at the end with some kind of statement like that. So this is okay. Of the 4 projects I'm currently doing, there's Naukowska, Niecierpliwi, Toborska, and Toporska. Taborska and Toporska. Now, Barbara Toporska was the wife of Józef Mackiewicz, known to the English language milieu, initially from not as a novelist, but as the person that first wrote in English about the Canon murders. Yeah, he was an émigré writer, virulently anti-communist, but although he was quite well known, his wife wasn't. And this is Barbara, and she wrote a number of novels. And the publisher in the UK, émigré publisher that owns the rights to both Mackiewicz and Toporska, approached me recently about doing something about Toporska, because in 2013, was the centenary of her birth, And this publisher, republished everything that she'd ever written, and there's quite a number of novels. But we decided to start with this one, Siostry, which means sisters, which was very well reviewed in the émigré press when it came out in 1966. And it won the Wiadomości Literackie Prize in that year. And I've read this book now. I think it's marvellous. Again, it's not a text that starts on page 1, works through with a plot to the end. It's about 300 pages, but it's composed of sort of vignettes or small incidents which have very wide backgrounds. For example, the two sisters, they're half-sisters. It shows them at different points in the late 1930s and early 1940s, all through the war, and their attempts to go into emigration. They eventually do get into emigration. One goes through Italy and ends up in Britain, the other ends up in Munich. But their story is it's just the sort of pin, the thing on which the main point of the novel is pinned. And it's about war, it's about being in Krakow during the bombings and the Soviet invasion. Yeah, so it's all about the war period seen through the eyes of these women. And it's interesting the kind of themes that they focus on. Yeah, and there's a lot about the Jewish, what happened to the Jews, what people knew at the time about the Holocaust, and it all comes through this very beautiful prose. And again, it's another translating challenge in that it's very stylistically pure, in the sense that it's compact. It has no unnecessary explanations. It's very poetic, but it's extremely beautiful. And I think this has got a lot going for it, this book. And I think it's been distributed in Poland. It's not actually ever been published in Poland, although it was discussed in 2013 and 14 in the media because of who she was and because of the centenary. So I do feel that with this is really a discovery. Wittenbergska and Malkowska and Żmichowska, they were well known in their day, and then for various reasons they were not being discussed. But this one, I think, has generally been forgotten by contemporary literary criticism, and she is somebody I feel quite a mission to re-establish, as I do with this lady. And I'm coming to my final bit now. Oh, that is her. Sorry, that is Tobolska. That was taken during the war, that picture, and this was her just before she died. She died of breast cancer a few months after Mackiewicz himself died. And part of Siostry is about the struggle with breast cancer. That's one of the main themes, apart from the war and everything else. Yeah. Right. Go back in time a bit. This is Mariana Machowska. And she wrote, I'll go to the next picture and then I'll come back to this one. What's called an Autobiography. Although it was first published in the book form in 1752, it was actually written a century earlier. And it was published because there was a beatification process started for her in this year, which got to nothing, and there's been another one started, and I haven't been following it recently, so I'm not quite sure how far it's got, if anywhere, in 2008. And this was actually a text that Machowska started writing. She was a discalced Carmelite. She started writing this in the 1640s, late 1640s, and then she became ill. And for the last few years of her life, she basically lay, and she dictated the rest of it to her confessor, who wrote it down. His original manuscript was unfortunately lost in the Second World War, but there are various copies of it. Yeah? However, just before the Second World War, in 1937, a Polish historian of religious history, Polish religious history, Karol Górski, republished it from the various sources he composed the text, wrote a long introduction. There's a lot in the introduction about the history of the Carmelites in Poland. And that was the text I was actually using until this one came out, which appeared in 2010 or 2011. And it's basically the same text, but it's been put into a much more modern orthography. Some of the bits that didn't make sense, they've tried to make sense of them. Because it wasn't, this is a very different sort of text. It's a spiritual work. And I'll read you a small bit of it in a minute, so you get the flavour. It's not a literary work, so the literary style, really is neither here nor there. So she wrote it in a sort of language that was contemporary to her, so I've put it into a contemporary language, and that's again something we can talk about. Yeah, but she was very famous because she had the stigmata. She died and she had the stigmata. She was very well known. She became very much revered. Yeah, and this autobiography, which is very much modelled on Teresa of Avila, was popular amongst, in the convents. It was used by the Carmelites and still is, it's sort of, so in that limited environment, it's very well known work. But I came across it when we were doing work with Borkowska and Czerminska for that general guidebook, and I got fascinated in it and with it, and I started to meet and speak to people that worked on it, and we realised that actually, this is a key work. This is a work that fits into all that, range of women spiritualists from German, Czech, whatever other languages, and going back to the Middle Ages. And it's really something that's not known about. And why is it not known about? Because it's written in a language that people generally don't know that are interested in those kind of subjects. So my aim with this really is to bring this into that general knowledge. So, what else can I say about it? Yeah, it was republished just recently because the Carmelites were celebrating 400 years of their presence in Poland. Now, I can say a little about some of the problems I've had with it and the reasons how I'm trying to overcome those problems. I don't want to talk for too long further, and then I'll just read you a little bit just to give you a taster, and then if anybody's got any questions, we can come back to it. Now, because this was a Carmelite work, I thought a good model to use for my translation work would be the latest translation into English of Teresa, the life of Teresa of Avila. This was done in the 80s by two men who translated it into modern English. Okay, so the thinking was, well, Teresa didn't write in any wonderful style. What she was trying to communicate was her relationship with God, her method of prayer, things like that. Therefore, we should use a vocabulary that is suitable for people to understand, because they were not doing it for the same purposes that I'm doing it. I mean, I'm doing it mainly for academic purposes, yeah, but they were doing it for spiritual purposes. So, if they were going to then, I mean, there's no reason why, my translation couldn't be used for spiritual purposes in the same way that Faustina Kowalska has been translated into English, and that was another source that I used for vocabulary, because it's used as a spiritual work, yeah. So, it has a dual purpose. Now, also, one of the reasons I decided to go for the modern English was because British or English spiritual writers of an earlier period, like Marjorie Kemp, Julian of Norwich, have recently been published, in updated translations, yeah, into modern English, because the medieval English is very difficult to understand if you haven't studied it. And I think, on that same basis, we could justify putting this into modern English. I mean, this is later, of course, this is 17th century. But if you think back to British history, English history in the 17th, Scottish history as well, in the 17th century, we did not have convents. We did not have Catholicism. It was banned. Under Elizabeth, James I, Charles I, Civil War, until James II came to the throne, it was banned under threat of death. Yeah. So you could not be a Catholic and publish as a Catholic in Britain. So, any kind of spiritual writing of this nature, and there was a small amount of it, There's an autobiography by a woman, a Catholic woman called Mary Ward, that was published in France at the time. I mean, it's nothing as complicated and as long as this. But, so there were some things, but they were not published in England. Okay, so there is no equivalent contemporary vocabulary. I mean, there is, if I'm looking for spiritual vocabulary for women, I have to look earlier, yeah? Julian of Norwich, Marjorie Kemp, or I have to look to modern English. But, the thing is, as I said, I don't think the style isn't what's important. So I think in this case, whereas, Naukowska or Toporska or even Żmijowska, the style is really important and interconnected, of course, with the meaning. Whereas this, but I mean, it's controversial. But I mean, if I was to attempt to translate that into any kind of, 17th century non-English, I don't think anybody would read it. Right, I'm going to lower the tone now, whichever way you want to look at it. I'll leave you with some thoughts about mental prayer. Now, this is a good example of the translation, translation technique, because the term that's usually used in relation to Teresa of Avila in English is contemplative prayer. She also uses, traditionally, in traditional translations, the word aridity, which in Polish is ochłość. Yeah, so it's a state where you are praying and you're trying to communicate with God and you feel completely devastated and out of touch and abandoned. Yeah, but these new translators, they use the word dryness because it's more accessible, and they use mental prayer instead of contemplative prayer. I must say this is one of the calmer parts of this book. There are some very violent scenes in this book. She did a lot of flagellation, a lot of torture of her own body, and this is also an aspect of, we might look at from a female point of view. Why did she do that? Denial of the body, yeah? But also you have to remember the circumstances in which it arose. As she was in Lwów. She was originally from Krakow, near Krakow. She was from a Schlachter background, but she originally joined the Carmelites in Krakow, and then she became the prioress of a convent in Lwów. And this was the time of Chmielnicki's uprising, the Cossack uprising against the Polish landlords. And it was a devastating time. They were very, very violent, and not only were Polish nobles murdered, but also it was a terrible time for the Jewish population. And before the Holocaust, this was the worst event, really, in diaspora history. Yeah, the Chmielnicki uprising of 1648. So these nuns, were living in this city when all this terrible stuff was going on all around them. And in the end, they fled. They went back to Krakow, and they all managed to get back. The whole group, about 25 of them, managed to get back unhurt to the Carmelite convent in Krakow. The method, this is chapter 10. And in the chapter heading, she refers to herself in the third person. But then when she actually writes, she writes in the first person. Chapter 10. On the method of prayer, which she had whilst still in the world. And what she means by still in the world is not in Carmel, because those of you who know about the history of Carmelites, they really did cut themselves off from the world completely within the cloister. The method of mental prayer which I used in the world, and which I doubt I made known sufficiently to your satisfaction, I now wish to make known to you more exactly. Now she's talking to the other nuns. Yeah, that's the imagined audience. My method of prayer